Hi, I'm Damon Smith, UW Field Crops Extension Pathologist, and today we're going to talk a little about wheat diseases and also wheat disease management. So before you really commit to a particular disease management program, or you're trying to use fungicides in a disease management program on wheat, you really need to take an integrated approach and have a plan of what you're going to do here. And so with wheat especially, it's very important. It's important in all field crops, but in wheat to do quite a bit of scouting and be familiar with what's going on in the field, because there are some particular times of the season when we need to make some critical in-season management decisions. We also need to be aware of the windows of opportunity for applying fungicides for wheat, and we also need to know the disease reaction for the particular varieties that we're working with. There are resistance genes available for various diseases of wheat, and so if we deployed those various genes in a particular field, we need to be aware of that so we can sort of assess the potential disease levels that we might see. We also need to estimate the yield potential that might be there, be able to identify the particular diseases. Again, scouting is going to be really important to help us determine those disease levels. And we need to be familiar with the various fungicides out there, because the fungicides, there's no one silver bullet out there to manage all the diseases. So we need to make sure we're identifying things that make the right selection decisions on which products to use. Now, when scouting, there's a few things we need to keep in mind when we're looking at diseases on wheat. We need to be able to identify the growth stage of wheat. That's probably one of the most important things we need to be able to do. And then we also need to be aware of the growth stage where the flag leaf emerges, because this is going to be a very important time, not only for a management decision, but this is the time when our yield potential is really starting to be determined. Most of the yield comes from photosynthesis from that flag leaf. So a lot of what we're going to be doing in terms of managing foliar diseases is going to be targeted at that flag leaf. So this is a very important part of the plant. We also need to scout the entire field, looking at various locations in that field to make our disease assessments. We don't want to look at say one area of the field or just the center of the field, or ride by in our pickup truck to make our scouting decisions. We need to get out and scout multiple areas and then assess the levels of disease in that area. And we need to be able to identify diseases properly and assess those severity levels. And if you can't identify a particular disease, be sure to be using a reputable disease diagnostic clinic, which can help you with that task. Now here is a diagram of the various growth stages of wheat. This is very important because, again, we need to make some management decisions, and it also will depend on when we see various diseases show up. For instance, powdery mildew can be a problem early on, even at the tillering stages, all the way through, and so we may need to do some management down here for powdery mildew. Things like septoria leaf blotch we may not see pop up until later in the season. Rusts, again, for us in Wisconsin, might be later after the jointing period where we see those show up. And then very late near heading is when we start to think about managing Fusarium head blight. And so being familiar with these growth stages here is very helpful, because there's going to be some critical timings here. For us in Wisconsin, one of the very critical times is going to be this Feeks 8 stage here, where we have the emerging flag leaf here. This is going to be a critical time for making a fungicide application in some years. And the other critical timing is going to be this 10.5.1 growth stage, where we have wheat flowering. Fusarium head blight can be a problem in years, some years in the state of Wisconsin, and this is going to be a critical time to manage Fusarium head blight here. So those two growth stages are going to be very important for us. Again, I've talked a little about the flag leaf here. It's very important that we're scouting at that emerging flag leaf stage, that Feeks 8 stage, because if we have foliar diseases started already at that point, a fungicide application would be necessary, especially for things like Septoria leaf blotch, to protect that flag leaf so that we can have good yield set on those plants. About 50% of our or more of the final yield actually is determined by the flag leaf, and so it's a very important part to protect. And disease on that leaf at that scouting time, so if we have damaged leaves lower in the canopy, we already have potential there to see damage on that flag leaf, and we need to put our fungicides on prior to damage appearing on that flag leaf. So scouting very critical at that time. Let's take a minute and talk about some of the various diseases which can cause problems on wheat in the state. The first would be powdery mildew. We do see this in most years in the state at varying levels. It is caused by the fungus Bloomeria graminis, and probably the most diagnostic symptom would be this white to gray growth on the surface of the leaves. And we can see this on leaves, stems, and heads, but commonly on leaves here in the state of Wisconsin. Later symptoms, we might actually be able to see signs of the fungus in this white growth. These will be fruiting bodies in the way of small black specks. These are what are called cleistothecia, and these give rise to ascospores. And the ascospores are actually what are the initial spores which infect the plant early in the spring. And so these ascospores will remain attached to wheat residue and overwinter on that wheat residue, and then available for the next wheat crop in a particular field. Infection can occur in the fall in the state of Wisconsin on winter wheat, and those spores are typically dispersed by wind. We can also have infection in the spring at the tillering stage, again through wind-dispersed spores. Infection is typically favored by cooler temperatures and then moist weather, so we have to have high relative humidity in the environment to really cause those infections. In terms of management, resistance, fungicide seed treatments, foliar fungicides can be useful, especially if we notice powdery mildew at even the very early stages at the first detectable node. And then, of course, at the Feeks 8 growth stage, that's going to be a very important timing for scouting for powdery mildew management. Another foliar disease that we see on wheat is Septoria leaf blotch caused by the fungus Septoria tritici. These symptoms can also be part of a complex with GLUME blotch, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides here. The symptoms will often start as more of a light green to yellow spot between the leaf veins on the lower leaves, and then it will work its way up the plant later in the season. So the earlier that this disease gets started, the more impactful it can be on the wheat crop. As the lesions grow and progress, the lesions will become more irregular shaped, will turn more brown, and may even have these yellow halos around them. And sometimes you can even find black speckles, which are pycnidia, which give rise to spores for secondary infection, which can be splashed up on upper leaves of the plant. So we think there can actually be two phases of Septoria leaf blotch in Wisconsin. There could be infection in fall on winter wheat sown, especially earlier on in September. So if we go for an early planting date, the risk might be a little higher for infection at that time. We also can have infections taking place in the spring and early summer once the plants are jointing, and we can see infection taking place there and slowly moving up the plant. The inoculum source is pycnidia that are left on residue, so wheat residue, and they can survive multiple years on that residue. Okay, and so the longer the rotation between wheat crops, the better off you might be for managing this disease. Temperature conditions which favor the disease include temperatures ranging from 59 to 68 degrees, and we have to have leaf wetness, extended periods of leaf wetness there during that temperature regime to have infection take place. Management is going to include certified disease-free seed with a seed treatment. There is little resistance currently available because breeding for rust resistance has led to a trend of increased susceptibility to septoria over the last few years, and so it will be hard to maybe find varieties with good resistance out there. So we're going to be looking at potentially using foliar fungicides to protect again that flag leaf. So if you notice septoria leaf blotch on the lower leaves prior to flag leaf emergence, then you're going to want to make a decision on applying fungicides to protect the flag leaf at that fixate growth stage. GLUME blotch is caused by Stagnospora nordum, which is also a fungus, and this is the fungus which can be in complex with Septoria tritici, causing Septoria leaf blotch. GLUME blotch typically causes more damage, however, on heads, which you can see some of that damage here, where we have brown spots on the glooms here, and sort of a moldy appearance that takes on the or that's on the heads here. Damage is typically later on winter wheat near maturity, and the symptoms will be most common starting at the tips and then working its way down the head. And so the diagnostic indicator, again, is going to be not only the moldy appearance, but again some fruiting bodies in the way of pycnidia, which will be on the heads here inside that coloration. So the disease cycle is very similar to Septoria leaf blotch. Again, the spores are borne on crop residue. The temperature ranges are going to be very similar, 68 to 81 degrees, and we have to have leaf wetness there in this temperature window in order to get infection and spore dispersal and those sorts of things. Management includes certified disease-free seed. Seed fungicide treatment can also be useful for any seed that is infected. Moving forward, and then there is a little bit of resistance to GLUME blotch available, so you might check out variety charts to see if there is any resistance if you have a field with high levels of GLUME blotch. And then rotation can also be important along with foliar fungicides. Fungicides at the heading time, if you're trying to combat Fusarium head blight, are going to be probably more effective also on GLUME blotch at that timing as well. Some other foliar diseases of wheat include what I'm going to call the rust complex, and we can actually find 3 different rusts on wheat in the state of Wisconsin. We can find leaf rust, which you see here, which makes these small reddish pustules on the leaves, and we can see different reactions actually due to different resistance genes that can be found in various wheat varieties. So they can range anywhere from small yellow flecks all the way on up to the more diagnostic red pustule. Probably most common in recent years on wheat has been stripe rust or yellow rust, as it might be called in Europe, which makes these very diagnostic elongated lesions with these erupting yellow pustules here. And you can see various reactions again depending on the resistance genes. And probably the least common of the rusts is going to be stem rust for us here. The reason being we do have very good resistance towards stem rust, but on occasion you can find some localized lesions in some fields. Just as a useful diagram here, I've got the stem rust life cycle here, but the life cycle of rusts in general is pretty similar. For stem rust, the rust needs to actually cycle between 2 different hosts here, and so barberry is going to be the other host that needs to be present near wheat fields in order for the complete life cycle to take place. And so for us, what happens is most of these spores are blown from the southern U.S. up each year in the way of these Uridina spores, or uridospores, as some folks call them. These spores are blown up through the United States, infect wheat, and then this is what's called the cycling spore, which can cause subsequent infections on plants. So we can have multiple cycles in a particular season. In areas where barberry is present, however, you can have the full life cycle take place, where we actually have teleospores, which make basidiospores, and those basidiospores can infect barberry. We get aciospores, which then can infect wheat, and then the uridinospores, which will cycle. But most important for us is going to be the uridinospores. Stripe rust, like I said, is probably the most common for us in terms of the rust complex here in Wisconsin. Stripe rust has been becoming an increasing problem here, maybe due to changes in climate, but also maybe changes in the varieties that we grow here in the state. And so over the last several seasons, we have seen quite a few fields with stripe rust issues. And it can infect all different parts of the plant, so we can see the damage on not only leaves but also even stems and sometimes even on the glumes. And you can see the different types of reactions here based on resistance genes. So here's a variety that has nice resistance, getting just some bleached but elongated lesions versus more susceptible varieties here in panel B. Like I mentioned, stem rust is not very important for us, but I do want to mention the fact that there is a resistance breaking race that's found in some areas in Asia. It has not made its way to North America, but I want you to be aware of this just in case you do see some stem rust. It's important that maybe those samples get sent to a diagnostic lab for careful documentation. Wheat rust, since 2012, we have seen some stem rust east of the Rockies. Most of the time this has been in research plots especially in this state. But again, be aware that stem rust can be out there, and send those samples in if you do see it. But the resistance genes do seem to be holding up good for us here in the state. In terms of management of these rusts, utilizing those resistance genes is going to be important. Scout frequently, especially during that flag leaf emergence stage. If you do see stem rust, make sure you send those samples in or notify, especially the USDA Cereal Disease Laboratory, so that we can document the occurrence of that pathogen. And just be aware of the existence of also stripe rust for us in the state. So if you see stripe rust come in early, especially during that Feeks 8 growth stage, a fungicide application would be important. In terms of disease, another disease that affects the head, very important for us in the state, is going to be Fusarium head scab. We've seen quite a bit of this over the last several years in the state, and the management period in season is going to be very important. So we're going to need to focus on the 10.5.1 growth stage, which is the initial flowering stage, in order for a fungicide application to be most efficacious for us. You can see the type of damage that we typically get here with this bleach type appearance, and sometimes we can even see the growth of the fungus in way of this pinkish spore mass, which is oftentimes observed. Now, the damage that the fungus can cause can compromise the kernels, and so a lot of times we'll see kernels with sort of the shriveled, or what we call tombstone appearance. And those kernels will be underweight, and during harvest, that's where we get a lot of our yield loss from Fusarium head scab, because those underweight kernels actually go out the back of the combine with the rest of the wheat residue. Now, the inoculum source for Fusarium head scab comes from crop residue and the organism surviving on that residue. This is the same Fusarium which can cause gibberella stalk rot and Fusarium issues on corn, and so a corn-wheat rotation is not going to be advised in a lot of cases because of that issue with the spores. And those spores are wind and rain disseminated, so when periods are very wet during the season, that's what's going to really drive the Fusarium head scab situation. Temperature ranges 65 to 85 degrees, so when you have wet conditions during flowering in this temperature range, it's going to be very conducive for that particular disease. And we are concerned about this disease not only from a yield loss standpoint, but also because we can have deoxynivalenol or vomitoxin or DON produced in that infected grain, and that is a feed issue or a human consumption issue with that mycotoxin. Management's going to include rotation, fungicide sprays at that 10.5.1 flowering stage, and then, of course, looking at the wheat scab monitor. You also might be able to use this tool to help you with some management decisions there. However, I would caution you, if it is raining during the flowering period, conditions are going to be very conducive, and so a fungicide application is going to be recommended during that time. To just shift gears to one other type of pathogen here which can cause damage on wheat in the state, we do have a virus which can be noticed in most years in wheat, and that would be barley yellow dwarf virus. It does cause issues on other small grains including barley and oats, and it is aphid transmitted. And the symptoms are similar to nutrient deficiency. You can see it here in this leaf that we see in the upper right hand corner with this yellowing and then purpling on the leaves, and it can cause some stunting on certain plants as well. It's favored by cool and moist conditions, especially on wheat that's planted very early in September, because there's a lot of aphid movement around still at that time, and so we worry about infections taking place at that time. And so if we see widespread damage, it's probably in fields that were planted a little too early. Management will include tolerant varieties, later planting to avoid those peak aphid flights, elimination of grassy weeds near a wheat field or volunteer weed in those fields, and then control of aphids with insecticides might also be useful, although we typically don't need to go this route here in Wisconsin. One final disease of note on wheat, very occasional on our modern wheat varieties, but something that we should be aware of is going to be irrigate caused by Claviceps purpurea. Here's an irrigate body. This is a disease that does affect the kernels on the head. Basically, we can have infection, especially in springs that are very wet, infections through the flowers, and we get the formation of this sclerotia, which basically replaces the kernel on the wheat head. Now, the issue here is that this particular fungus can also produce some toxins, which can be an issue for animals and also human consumption, and so we really want to watch this. In the most of our wheat varieties now, they don't flower over a wide enough period to see widespread irrigate issues, and so this could be more of an occasional disease in wheat. But if you do manage rye, this can be a pretty significant problem in rye, and so you're going to want to be aware of it. In terms of management here, crop rotation is important, deep plowing, elimination of grassy weeds, looking at certified seed so we don't have an issue in save seed where these sclerotia can actually be planted with the wheat seed, and then sclerotia removal by gravity separation or sieving can also be important to get rid of the sclerotia out of a particular seed lot. With that, if you have any further questions, you can feel free to contact me. My phone number is here, also my email address, and we do maintain a website where you can find information about many of these diseases and also research reports on that website. And of course, you can always contact your local extension agent.